right, welcome everyone. Happy Friday. So glad to be here with ACPA Live with Leadership. My name is Craig Elliott. I'm the current president of ACPA, and my pronouns are he, him, his. And I'm grateful to be joined with two fabulous, amazing colleagues and members of ACPA. Love to have you introduce yourselves before we jump in. So Darbi, why don't we have you start?
Hi, everybody. My name is Darbi Roberts. I'm the Executive Director of International Students Student Services at Southern New Hampshire University, and I've been involved in the commission with ACPA for quite some time, and I'm really excited about today.
All right, and welcome everyone. My name is Gudrun Nyunt. I am a visiting assistant professor at Northern Illinois University, and I also serve as chair of the Commission for Global Dimensions of Student Development for ACPA. And my pronouns are she, her, hers.
Awesome. Thank you both, and just grateful to have you, all of our listeners and watchers out there checking in with us. Today's event, we're going to talk about international education and higher education and student affairs and connections with racial justice and decolonization, and talking about how those intersect and overlap, and where some unique differences are, and how we begin to move forward toward an idea of racial justice and decolonization with what I might say with a international or global perspective. So before we get into that, just want to do our land acknowledgement, and really continuing ACPA's mission and fostering learning through the generation of knowledge that we'd like to acknowledge. The land that we are meeting on today is the original homelands of, in the DC area. I'll give all these tribes and Native communities that belong there, because that's where our central office is, but we'll also talk about the communities in which each of us are on in different parts of the United States. So the original homelands of the Piscataway, the Anacostank, the Mattapanians, the Nangumek, the Pamunkey, the Tahinants, Nanticoke, Chickahominy, Manakun, Mattaponi, Nansemond, Rappahannock, Aquino, Hini, Onami, and Assateague, the original tribes in the Washington, D.C. area. We also have the Potawatomi tribe in the Chicago area, and the Pennacook tribe in the Manchester area, and for me, in the Northern California Bay Area, the Ohlone tribe. So we acknowledge the painful genocide and forced removal in the United States of the indigenous peoples, and we honor and respect these tribes and the peoples who were removed, but also are still deeply connected to and still live in these areas. And we advocate in higher education and student affairs professionals to honor the land that we are all on. And so we encourage our listeners and watchers to also spend a moment and get connected to the indigenous peoples that are still in your area. So with that said, just happy to jump on in and really just talk about racial justice, decolonization, globalization, international education, all of those things. And so really, I think the first place is probably to start is, as we're talking about international education, as I've learned, it's a whole lot more than what I originally thought it was. And so perhaps we can talk about the context of what we're referring to and talking to about international education. And what does it mean to you both?
Yeah, and I can get us started here. This is something that as a commission we've struggled with, right? Because there's so many things that really fall under international education, and sometimes it really feels overwhelming of what do you focus on. But I think some of the big things, right, are our students, so U.S. students studying abroad, it's international students attending U.S. institutions, it's U.S. institutions engaging in the internationalization of higher education, whether that includes encouraging study abroad or international students coming here, but also educating our students on what it means to be a global citizen, something we see right in a lot of mission statements across institutions. And then also acknowledging, right, that higher education looks differently around the world, and that we work with higher education institutions around the world through branch campuses, through collaborations, and obviously there's power dynamics right there that we'll get to talk about in this conversation.
Great. Darbi, anything you want to add?
No, I think that's great, and I would also another component of perhaps not officially but unofficially is the role of non-U.S. citizens or people who have been educated outside the United States in what higher education looks like in the U.S. Because there's certainly, I think the Commission tends to serve as a home for that group of people, and so understanding what kind of perspectives they bring from other contexts to the United States and how we work with students here.
That's great. Great. Thank you both. So that's good. I think I think there's some conventions about what international education looks like. And again, from and from my own kind of context, it was a very U.S. centric way that, U.S. international education was often about students in the United States going elsewhere. So it's much more robust and richer than that. And I think, as Gudrun talked about, there's all kinds of power dynamics in there. Taking a U.S. centric lens and imposing that on that, which is not always a good thing for our learners, and not always a good way to approach our work. And so I think so there's that really wonderful part about where racial justice and decolonization can fit in, and where a really nice overlap. And the three of us have had some nice conversations. So I'd love to hear from you both why is it important to consider racial justice and decolonization, or that framework of power, privilege, oppression, as we're talking about international education and what that means.
Yeah, I think for me, a lot, right, goes back to the concept of globalization and knowing often that. And so anytime we're interacting with people from around the world, there's those power dynamics, right? And so there's someone usually who benefits more than someone else. And we can apply that to any of the, different topics that we talked about that fall under international education. If we think about study abroad, when we go to other countries, what does that mean, right? Like we're using them to educate our students in some ways, and then when there isn't that equilibrium of power there, that can become really problematic, right? Of how we're looking at these other countries and what our students are getting out of it. And so one of the things I think why it's so important to think about racial justice and decolonization when we do international education is that we can really easily, with the best intentions, teach our students the completely wrong lessons. And so my dissertation actually focused on study abroad, and it wasn't focused on racial justice and decolonization at all. It was focused on the learning that happened there and how educators can shape that learning. But one of the things that came out, and that wasn't intended, but in a qualitative studies, you never know what happens, was looking at students really talking about host nationals as like the other, and this kind of othering, and really talking about them as, we go there and we help them. And even though there was a service learning component and there was some conversations around that just didn't really sink in. And there was still at the end that impression of, we can teach them how to do things better. We know the right way to do things, which is so problematic. And so it was just interesting, right, how that wasn't even the intention of my dissertation, but that's something that keeps popping up in anything we do in international education.
Yeah. Wow. I think that's, go ahead, Darbi. Yeah.
Well, no, I was just going to add, that looks very similar to what, I speak from my own experience, having worked for a U.S. branch campus in the Middle East for 3 years at the beginning of my career. And so when we, there's a lot of parallels to be drawn there, right? Our intent is to, whether or not you're working at a branch campus or a university, we bring our own lens, and our intent is to serve and to work with students, but either the impact of exporting the U.S. model, student affairs or of education to different areas, or just the individual impact that we have on students by not being culturally aware and exhibiting cultural humility in our interactions with them can be very detrimental to the development of the student. And so being aware of that piece as well.
Oh, that's great. So it brings a question: how do we help our students and our professionals that are going to other places begin to examine their frames, their lenses, our lenses that we bring with them, and how do we do that pre-work in a way that I would also say that's not just the international office division's responsibility? That how do we collectively own this so that we're working in partnership toward this, but it's not, we don't all come to you to say, help me as I'm going to another country.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak from, so I do work for an international office at a university, and I think a common pattern to fall into is, oh, this is an international student, send them to international student services, or I'm struggling. I noticed that an international student is struggling, or I'm struggling with this interaction with an international student. Help me understand. I think to a certain extent there is some role that people working in international offices can play in terms of awareness building and helping people recognize, having that conversation, recognizing power and privilege and the perspective of cultural awareness and that sort of stuff. I think that's definitely a role that those people can play. Not all people that work in international offices are also prepared to have those conversations either, right? Okay. So that's an assumption. But also, I think, being willing to and building into the practices and policies and procedures of a university that require responsibility on everybody to work with international students, to serve them in the same capacity. I think that those are systemic issues that universities really have to look at. Is it that your procedures and policies require international students to go to that international office every single time they have an issue? If that's the case, you should look at what those policies are that are requiring that, and think about how to change it such that everybody is responsible for that. And then once you increase that exposure, then you can start having broader conversations about how everybody's responsible for working with international students and with students studying abroad as well.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, Darbi, you bring up a good point, and we need to look at those structures, because I think a lot of times it's those structures that actually perpetuate a lot of the injustice that we see in decolonization. And so, in study abroad, we need to examine, what do the structures of our programs look like? What's kind of the basis they're set up on? How are we interacting with host nationals, right? What are our goals? Are we thinking about how we're impacting these countries that we're going to, and how we can work together, truly work together, and have those conversations before we set up the structures. And so I think it really goes back to us re-examining all the structures that we have in place and how they're impacting injustice or perpetuating injustice in ways that we're not intending to do, but we are.
Yeah. Now, it makes me think about it, just the ways that we're probably continuing to marginalize international students and students from other countries unintentionally through trying to do really, the good thing, trying to connect. Well, so, and I think about trying to thinking the best of how these structures come across. We're trying to create links for students from other countries in our campuses to try to keep a central hub for people to go to. But we end up kind of creating extra steps and barriers to all kinds of other avenues, or really focusing on on here's the way, rather than here are all the ways that you can interact. And this is just one really good resource, but you don't have to. But thinking about how that continues, it reminds me of just kind of this internalized dominance that I think that I still carry with me, even though I'm trying to work on it, about how as you said, we know the way. Here's the way we want you to be on this campus, and so we kind of layer a frame on that, and it's powerful, powerful.
And it dials down, it drills down all the way to things like the way that you do your insurance, the way that you, process students through wellness, the way that housing deposits are collected and students are assigned to rooms. I mean, it's everything.
Yeah.
I think it's also right when we think about international students, a lot of times we talk about international students as like this one group, and they're not one group, right? There's racial dynamics within international students. I mean, I know my experience coming as an international student from Austria was very different, right, than a student coming from China or a student coming from, Ghana. And so there's definitely, being white, I came into this country and I kind of fit in. And so that was very different than when I later, started talking with other international students, and they were like, oh, my experience was totally different, right? And people thought my accent was cool, and they didn't maybe necessarily get that. The accent was annoying, or people were like, I can't understand what you're saying. And so I think it really made me aware, too, of some of those privileges that I have, identifying, being white and being seen as white in this country.
Yeah, right. And really kind of having to back into understanding what that structure is, and kind of learning about what's happening to you and having a different experience than colleagues. Yeah.
And we didn't really talk about, Americans going abroad to work at universities elsewhere. And I might be getting into the next question a little bit, but, I think the habit of mind in terms of using this framework and thinking about how do we prepare to do some of those things, and how do we help colleagues prepare to do some of those things, I think that starts at the graduate level.
Right.
And I'm willing to go out on a limb and say that graduate programs aren't doing that very well right now.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and I appreciate it. I mean, so both of you were talking about, and you said this earlier, Darbi, but the idea of cultural humility. And, I think that, so I think there's a really, really powerful concept there. And even just, it reminds me of, Pope, Reynolds, and Mueller just came out with a revision of their book, which is really talks about how to bring this this layer of reflection into this practice of us connecting and engaging across difference. And so that's a great resource for our watchers and readers. Just kind of managing time here and seeing we got a comment from Ray Plaza. So hi, Ray, thanks for chiming in. And he says, in terms of U.S. students, faculty, staff going abroad, it could be a great opportunity to engage with groups like Diversity Abroad that are examining the relationship of diversity and going abroad. So thanks, Ray, for that comment. Any experience with Diversity Abroad or that idea?
Yeah, not necessarily experience with Diversity Abroad, but what I would say is I think that there's a lot of room for international offices and offices of diversity or multicultural affairs to do a lot of really great collaborative and intersectional work. Because the reality is some students who aren't international students, they're considered domestic students, and they have maybe first-generation Americans. They may still have a very much a connection to the culture of their parents or the home country of their parents. And oftentimes diversity offices, people who work in diversity offices are better versed in understanding what racial and social justice looks like and how to have a conversation about it. And so utilizing and collaborating with other offices, other identity offices across the university is imperative in having a broader conversation around this topic, but particularly people in international offices might have some really great things to learn from models and dialogue processes and that sort of thing to be able to have these conversations in the first place.
Right. Yeah, that's great. That's great.
Yeah. And I don't.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
definitely
No,
think
go ahead.
diversity abroad, is a great resource, and a lot of our members of the commission are members of diversity abroad as well. And we've had some speakers from them at our webinars too. We're also another resource that might be helpful for people viewing this. Together with ACUI and IASIS, we're organizing a webinar series that's coming up and starting in October. So the first one will be October 24th, of really looking at student services around the world. And so I think sometimes, right, some of that cultural humility is just lacking because we don't know how things work in other countries. And one of the things that I found coming to the US kind of as an outsider, right, is that there is that pride and that nationalism, and that's great, but it sometimes leads to this idea of like, oh, our higher education system is better. And, growing up in Austria, that was not the impression that I had. And still, that's not necessarily the impression I have. And I think there's a lot of things, right, that our Austrian system does really well, but that people here don't know about. And so there'll be an opportunity to really hear from speakers around the world, thanks to IASIS and them bringing in a lot of our IASIS members to really talk about, right, what is student services like in their countries? What are some of the challenges that they are facing, and what does it look like? And I think if we can just learn more about what other countries do, it will really help us see the great things that they're doing as well, and recognize that there's a lot we could learn from them as well, not just us. A lot of times, and we hear that sometimes as a commission, right, a lot of times we're the ones providing education to people from other countries of saying, this is how we do it here, and this is a great way, and you should do it this way. And it really needs to become that conversation of, how do you do it? What can we learn from each other, right? And how can we all together figure out what's a good way to do this? And that way might differ by country and by culture too. And so really recognizing those differences, but also appreciating what everyone else has to bring to the table.
Right. Definitely. What a great way to end. But coalitions and partnerships, and us spending the time to do that work, and working together because it matters. So it has gone quickly. It is almost time it's time, really. And so just any parting thoughts from either one of you, and Darbi, why don't we start with you, just for anything that you want to add and leave us with today.
I think kind of going back to what I was saying about other identity offices, I think the more I learn about, the more I work with other identity offices, the more I actually think international student services offices are in fact identity offices. And I don't think that we treat them as such all the time. And I think we should do them. I think we should treat them more like identity offices, because they are. Even though there's multitude of identities of students that are coming here, we ultimately don't just offer immigration services. You need to do more than just that, because students crave it, they need it. Their identities, as Gudrun said, are sometimes being turned upside down as they come here to the U.S., and they need a space to be able to figure all of that stuff out. And so I think intersectional work among identity offices is incredibly important, and can also be very, very a really great learning opportunity for people who work in all of those offices to be able to share and share the work. So.
Excellent. Beautiful. Thank you. Gudrun, anything that you want to leave us with?
Sure. I think for me, the big thing is we just need to start asking those questions. A lot of times I think we're hoping for those answers, right? And I know as ACPA leadership, we've struggled with some of that, of figuring out how many answers do we give and how much do we ask questions. But a lot of times I'm like, I don't have the answers, right? As a commission chair, when I talk with my commission, I'm like, I don't have the answers, but we need to start asking the question. And I think as offices and as professionals at universities, we need to do the same thing. We might not know how to do study abroad through a racial justice and decolonization lens, or how to work with international students in that way. But we need to start asking, how could we do it, and try out different things and just start moving the needle somewhere, right? And so that's the biggest thing I think I would want to leave people with, is just start doing something.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you. And so I think that's the perfect place to leave it. Just great wisdom from the both of you, and just thank you for your time today. And to our watchers and listeners, just grateful for you joining us today, and really helping us continue to explore how we can bring this model of racial justice and decolonization into all of our parts in student affairs and higher education, and really begin and continue that transformation for the transformation of higher education. So we're grateful for you, for your leadership and engagement and commitment to transforming what we're all here to do. So thank you all. Have a great day. Looking forward to seeing you in Nashville in 2020, and where we will continue to have these conversations. So have a great day.